We might also add a different category, one called unknown. Why would we call it unknown? Well, a lot of people debate about who wrote Hebrews. Jerry, who wrote Hebrews?
I think Paul.
Paul. Jim, who wrote Hebrews? No, doesn't know. Anyone else? Who wrote Hebrews?
Everybody believes Paul. Doesn't say.
Doesn't say. And so, I think I need to turn my page here. There we go. And so, a lot of, people may say Silas, Clement of Rome. Who's Clement of Rome? I know, he was a 2nd century historian. Silas, Philip, even Aquila and Priscilla. But the most likely names given are Apollos, and Barnabas. For part of my life, I've believed that it was Barnabas. I kind of switched back and forth between was it Barnabas or Paul. But the early church fathers said it was Paul, and it's only been within recent history being only the last few hundred years, that people have debated, well, who actually wrote it? It doesn't sound like Paul. I don't know. If Jerry, and I'm picking on you because I'm terrible with names, and I'm sorry. So I'm picking on you. If you wrote a letter to someone, would it be different than if you got up in the pulpit and you were preaching to a congregation? Well, I think so. And so one of the theories is, and I think it's a pretty good one, is that Hebrews is actually a sermon that Paul preached. And like most traveling preachers, he would have had one sermon or two or three, however many, but these would have been a sermon that he preached at each stop, so he didn't have to come up with a new sermon for each town and each congregation that he went to. And so one of the theories, of course, is that when he was arrested and taken to Rome, and Luke went with it, that he may have dictated this sermon to Luke. And Luke may have written it down. And so Luke writing down Paul's sermon would probably sound different than it did when it came out of Paul's mouth. And so that's one possibility.
Gary, didn't
yes.
Paul always say that he wrote a book when he wrote it?
In Luke?
Well, in the epistles.
Say it. Okay, ask your question.
Doesn't he always say that he wrote the book?
Yeah, in his other epistles, he said that he was the one that was writing it. He said that, this is Paul. Okay. In this book, he doesn't say that. Again, though, if he's standing in the pulpit preaching,
that's what I was saying.
Yeah, he wouldn't have introduced himself. Everyone supposedly would have known who he was. So the fact that he doesn't introduce himself in the letter doesn't mean that he wasn't the author of it. And then again, of course, there's the possibility that it was someone else. Next slide. So, what we're going to be studying today are the general epistles, the general letters, minus Hebrews. Hebrews, I've got 13 weeks. Well, I don't know that I could cover Hebrews in 13 weeks. So, we're not going to cover Hebrews. In fact, I think the last time I was up here was 2 years ago. It was before Greg left. I think I was teaching Hebrews, wasn't I? Anybody remember? If I don't remember, why would you remember, right? Okay. But I think that's what I was teaching last time I was up here. So I'm just continuing from where I left off. So we're going to be studying the letters that are written by James and Peter and John and Jude. Now, called the Catholic Epistles. What does Catholic mean? It means universal. It doesn't mean that it was, has anything to do with the Catholic Church, okay? Catholic simply means universal. And so these are also called the universal or the Catholic epistles. And so they were not, as we've already said, written to individuals. They were not written to a specific congregation. We just finished a study of Corinthians. And what is the one thing we know about 1 Corinthians?
Young church.
Oh, it was a young church. It was written to the church in Corinth for specific purposes and to address specific issues with specific instructions. And so that's what those epistles were about. But these epistles, these letters, with two possible exceptions, these letters were written to all Christians, to the first people who read it. We're not told who they are, but they were written to people who needed Christian instruction. Okay, and so when John sat down, or James sat down to either write or to dictate his letter, his intent was that all of the Jews who had been scattered throughout the world would be the audience of these of this letter. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide. See, not being able to change my slides is getting me off here. Okay, so so that's why I've named this series "To Whom It May Concern," because we really don't know who they were written to, except, as I said, two possibilities, two possible exceptions to that, and we'll talk about that. These letters were written to, even though they may have gone initially to a Jewish audience, that they deal with issues that are real to you and me today. They deal with issues that, unlike 1 Corinthians, where a specific issue that dealt with that congregation, these books deal with issues that you and I can identify with, and we can read them and we can say, you know what? James was talking to me. Peter was talking to me. John, Jude, he was talking to me. But so, and so this is why I have chosen to call this series "To Whom It May Concern." Next slide, please. Okay, and so they were written to the community of Christ believers, with the possible exception of two books. And I say possible. The first one, 2 John, was addressed to the elect lady. Whose Bibles, are you following along? Whose Bibles say the chosen lady? So, it's variously translated chosen lady or elect lady. Any idea who that might have been?
Mine says the elder to the elect lady and her children.
Okay. The elder to the elect lady and her children.
If the church is the bride of Christ, then maybe it's just the church in general.
And so if the church is the bride of Christ, it could have just been the church in general. And so the children would be the members, or possibly congregations that congregation had planted, possibly. Other possibilities are the lady, the person could have been named Chosen, or she could have been named Lady. Lady is a name that some people give their children even today. Yes?
But in my version it says lady chosen by God.
Lady chosen by God. Okay, what version is that?
That's the NIV.
NIV? Okay. And so that the translators there went a little bit further with who they think it was sent to. Yeah, right. So, but we just don't know. Again, the message that is sent to her about conducting herself and the church conducting itself in love is a message we can all take to heart. Now, 2 Peter is a little different. It is addressed to an individual, to Gaius. And yet, the message to Gaius is a message that we can all benefit from. Next slide. I'm going to have to speed up. See, I was concerned that I wasn't going to have enough material today. And now I'm concerned that I'm not going to get through it. So, there are some issues. There are some controversies over some of these books, particularly 2 Peter. Again, kind of like with Hebrews, they said, well, it couldn't have been written by Paul because it just doesn't sound like Paul. The style, and if I'm getting out of the camera range, I'm sorry. I'll try not to. It just doesn't sound like Paul. It couldn't have been written by Paul. Well, kind of the same thing is said about 2 Peter. The church fathers said that 1 Peter was written by Peter. Okay? There's little controversy over who wrote 1 Peter. So the logic goes, well, if Peter wrote 1 Peter, he didn't write 2 Peter, because the two books are just so entirely different in style and tone and language. But let me ask you something. If you wrote a letter to one of your children who was going through rough times, and you knew they needed encouragement, and you knew you had some things to say to them that might lift them up and build them up, what kind of language would you use? Soft. Encouraging. Okay. Now, if one of your children were going off the deep end and really needed to hear a stern, tough message, what kind of language would you use in that letter? Direct? Stern? Okay.
Impatient.
So I don't think that the argument that, well, these two letters are so different that they could not have been written by the same person. I just don't buy that explanation. Certainly in 2 Peter he says, I am Peter. And then he gives specific examples of things that he saw the Lord do, things that happened to the Lord. He uses specific references to things that Peter would have experienced. And the people who say that it wasn't written by Peter say, well, these were some people who wanted you to think it was written by Peter, so they wrote those things to make you think it was written by Peter. On the other hand, 1 Peter contains none of that kind of material. And someone might say, well, since it contains none of that kind of material, I'll be sure that 1 Peter was written by Peter. Maybe it's more reasonable to assume that 2 Peter was written by Peter instead of 1 Peter. Well, each of these books are going to have things that we'll discuss in the introductory material for each of those books. Let me just say this. It is my firm belief, and I'm sure the firm belief of everyone I'm talking to here, all of these books were inspired by God. The men who wrote them were inspired by God. The words of God were placed in them, and they wrote them down on whatever material they were writing on at the time. And so, regardless of what the experts say about these books, it is my belief, and I'm sharing that with you, that they are inspired and God spoken. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do you think? What are your thoughts and comments? Great.
I used to work at a client's factory down in Columbus, Indiana, and two different people ran the line that made the Ford F-150 CV joint.
Okay.
But, I don't know who was running that machine when they made my Ford Expedition, which has a Ford F-150, chassis to it, but the machine and the Ford Expedition was approved by the engineers at Ford. So, like, who wrote it? Who wrote the epistle? At some point, it's inspired word of God, and, I don't really worry too much who made the CV joint in my Ford F-150, but, Ford has a reputation that some people like or don't like. It's kind of, at some point, it doesn't matter a whole lot who wrote it. But, it's good practice to study it, right? But I'm not really going to take apart my Ford Expedition. I'm going to drive it and use it.
Okay. Did everybody hear what he said? His Ford, the universal joint in his Ford Expedition was built for the Ford F-150, and different people would have been running the production line and had actually turned out that piece of equipment, but it was engineered by Ford, and so no matter who was running the assembly line, that part came from the mind of one person. And so if I can extrapolate that, no matter who is writing down the messages that we read, they came from God. They came from the mind of God. And so as we read any of the books of the Bible, they all have different flavors and different styles and read somewhat differently, but they all came from the mind of God. Is that okay?
Yep, very well. You're a good listener.
John.
Sometimes when I read the things that experts write, and I'm no expert, so I don't. But when I read these things, I think of what Festus said to Paul in Acts. He said, "Your great learning has driven you mad." And when I read writings from experts, I'm thinking, this is just so off the wall. It doesn't make sense to me. And sometimes the experts just want to throw things out there that it's just a waste of time. And if we're confident that, and we are confident that these are inspired writings, and that God through the Holy Spirit has penned these for our benefit, to just dissect them endlessly is a waste of time, and it will drive us mad.
Yes. Did everybody hear what John had to say? I'll try to encapsulate it. I don't know I'll do as good a job as I did with it, Craig. But the people, these experts who write about the books of the Bible,
Commentators.
the commentators, they just pick everything apart. I'm going to put in my words. They want to put together a book, right? They've got something to sell, and they don't want to write down the same thing that someone else wrote, so they have to come up with something new.
And it becomes madness.
And it becomes madness, as John says. And so, yeah, totally agree, John. I'm not saying don't read commentaries. If I hadn't read a commentary, I wouldn't have a lesson this morning. So
Just have a healthy opinion of what they're doing and what their goal is.
yeah,
Because they help. They're very helpful.
they're very helpful,
To be able to weed through it.
and they can help you think of things that, hey, I hadn't thought of that before, or maybe they'll say what you've been thinking in such a way that, hey, yeah, and then you'll just borrow that from, you'll plagiarize that and use it in your lesson. Would I do that? Next slide. Okay. I hope you're okay with the introductory material here. I hope it's not boring to you. I'm trying not to make it dry, and I'm trying to make it interesting. I hope it is. Okay, James starts out, next slide. James starts out like a letter. He says, this is James, servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. And then he says, and he addresses it, and he says who it's to. He says it's to the, I'm sorry?
12.
To the 12 tribes that are dispersed. The dispersion or the diaspora. So if I say the word diaspora, I'm using a fancy word, so I hope it's kind of like, the commentators that John was talking about. So if I say diaspora, I'm talking about the great dispersion. And so it starts off like a letter. But then, what happens? What happens after the introduction?
According to the slide, it becomes more like a sermon.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, after the introduction, it becomes more like a sermon. Or at least he becomes very, can I use the word preachy?
Didactic.
I'm sorry?
Didactic.
Didactic. Explain that word to me.
Like a teacher.
Like a teacher.
Preachy was good.
Preachy was good. You like preachy, okay. And so he deals with many of the same topics that Jesus dealt with in the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, when you start off with verse 2, he's telling his listener, telling his audience to be happy when you face trouble. And what does that sound like? It sounds like Beatitudes. Thank you. And so it certainly seems to be written by somebody who spent some time with Jesus Christ and who spent some time listening to his words and listening to the thoughts of God. Okay. Something this document doesn't do, it doesn't deal with typical Christian doctrinal issues. Does it mention baptism? No, he doesn't mention baptism. Would Paul have mentioned baptism? Oh, he does many times. But James doesn't mention baptism. Does he mention the crucifixion? No, not really. Not specifically. How about the Lord's Supper? Now, he doesn't deal with specific, what we would call Christian doctrinal issues. However, he deals with issues that are real to all God-fearing people, to all Christ followers. As I don't know if I said this before or not. We don't know if it was written. Well, I'm getting actually ahead of myself, but that's okay because it's after 10 and I need to be stepping it up. We don't know exactly who he was writing it to, although it may have been to all Jews who had been dispersed, or it may have just been to the Christian Jews. We don't know. But the message contains instructions that would have been real and meaningful to any God-fearing person. And so these things are meaningful and real to you and me as a group of God-fearing people. Many times the things that he says almost sounds like they came out of Proverbs. James says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Proverbs says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. And so, as we go through James, we're going to see that a lot of the things that he says, they're two-part one-liners. That sounds very much like not Revelations, very much like Proverbs.
You know, Gary, when I read James and considering that he's the brother of Jesus, and then in John when it says the world didn't recognize me, I think about him growing up with Jesus, and all of a sudden my brother is the Lord. I read this book as, listen to me, and with great urgency, I've got to tell you these things.
Yeah. Okay.
Because this is important.
All right. Did everybody hear?
Maybe not the people online.
Maybe not the people online. And so the comment was that growing up with Jesus, that James, and we haven't identified him yet as being this person, but that's okay, it's good. Rick said that growing up with Jesus, he would have had insight into things that Jesus believed and things that Jesus taught and things that Jesus did. And so here James is getting probably close to the end of his life, and he's saying, I've got something to tell you, and here's what it is, and I want you to know this because this is important. I have a personal knowledge of these things because I was with him. And so I want you to know these things. And so, good comment, Rick. I think that's a very valid observation. So who wrote the book? Next slide, please. I'm going to kind of rush through this a little bit. He says he is James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. There are several people in the book, in the New Testament, that might fit that description. Certainly, James, brother of John, son of Zebedee. What do you think? He was with Christ. He was one of his inside guys, right? He was there at the Transfiguration. And in fact, when we get to Peter specifically speaks about Christ at the Transfiguration, so as though he was an eyewitness, which he was. James, the brother of John, was there in Gethsemane. Jesus asked 3 of his closest friends to go with him a little ways off from the others to pray. And James, the brother of John, was one of those people. He was one of the inside guys. But he probably met his death early. In Acts, we're told that when King Herod Agrippa came to power that he wanted to gain favor with the religious leaders, and so he did some things that he thought would make the religious leaders happy. And so one of the things was that he had James killed. And so this probably, James was one of the early martyrs, certainly before or after Stephen, but one of the early ones that we're told about in Acts. And so when James says that he's sending this letter to the 12 tribes of the dispersion of the diaspora, well, the diaspora, even though by the time of James' death, the church had started to spread out, it wasn't the great dispersion that James, the writer of the book, talks about. So likely it was not James, the brother of John. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Yes.
Well, in my version, it said that it was a half-brother of Jesus who was a leader of the Jerusalem church. And the Jerusalem church at that time was one that many of the outlying congregations looked to and wrote to for instructions in certain matters, clarification of certain matters, and so it would make sense, well, besides the fact that he would have been with Jesus through his childhood, and it would make sense if he were a leader in the Jerusalem church, that he would be encouraging and instructing these churches that were asking for that.
And so that's the rest of my lesson. So, yeah. And I really do need to get to that part. So next slide.
Hey, Jerry, just a couple of things.
Yeah.
And that's why I like the online app. I can switch back and forth to compare versions with versions. You had up one there that he was the brother of John. NIV says he's the brother of Jesus. And some of the other things that I noticed about James too, and it's still real today, this conversation is works important. That's faith, and James goes through and he addresses that. Somebody had that same question that I received months ago, had to explain it. But
Yeah,
I
and
encourage everybody just to compare versions.
compare versions.
And
And
if you've got an online app, you can do it very quickly.
And the point of that slide was to say that it was not James, the brother of John. So,
I didn't see that.
okay. So, no, James' brother of John probably was not him because, well, he was probably dead by the time this letter was written. Two others could have been James, son of Alphaeus. He's only mentioned, he was one of the apostles, but he is only mentioned in passing. Could have been James, the father of Judas, not Iscariot. But again, he was only mentioned in passing, probably not those two. Next slide, please. So that leaves us with James, the brother of Jesus, or half-brother of Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph. Next slide. I gotta get to it. Next slide. Okay, here's the thing. As was just said, this James was seen as, you can go ahead and shut the slides off. This James was seen as a leader, not just seen as a leader, he was a leader of the church in Jerusalem. Paul called him an apostle. When Paul went to Jerusalem, he tells us that he went to Jerusalem and the next day he went to see James and the rest of the elders. And so James was a leader of the church in Jerusalem. In fact, when Paul went and said, there's people who came from here and they're telling, the Gentiles that they have to become Jews to be Christians. And it was James who stood up and spoke, but he was probably speaking on behalf of the other elders, saying, okay, we didn't tell them to say these things. And James and the other elders, and James probably was the one who penned a letter to the Gentile Christians, telling them not to let these people disturb them. And they said, you are not required to become a Jew to become a Christian. And so James was probably the person who penned that letter. Here's the thing, and then I'm going to have to shut up. But the author of this letter expected people to know who he was simply by the fact that he said, I'm James. Now, if I were to write a letter and simply say, Gary, this is from Gary, and I were to send it out to all the congregations in Indianapolis, well, except for you all, they'd say, who's Gary? Okay. But James expected that wherever this letter went, people would know who it was coming from. That people would know, yeah, this is James, the elder of the church in Jerusalem. And specifically to the people that he was writing to, he had a concern for these people. A lot of these people were coming from the Jerusalem church. He knew them personally. They were people that he loved and cared for. And he was concerned that now that they're out here in the world, they may start slipping. They may start falling back. They might, they might fall back into their old ways of living. And so he was concerned for them. And so he wrote to them to tell them, hold on to your faith. And so James had something to say. He had something to tell them.
Gary?
Yes.
I think it's the same as in, I think it's 1 Corinthians 15, where Jesus appeared to James and then the apostles.
Yes.
So he doesn't say James and then elaborate on which James.
No.
He says,
Appeared to.
James.
So in 1 Corinthians, Paul says that after his resurrection, Jesus appeared to 500 men at one time. And then he appeared to James and the rest of the disciples, the rest of the apostles. And so, but James was the one who was singled out. He was the one that was mentioned specifically. And so, James knew Jesus. He didn't become, here's the other thing, listen. He didn't become a believer until after the crucifixion. Kind of like you and me, right? I mean, we didn't have a choice. But he learned to believe in Jesus the same way you and I have learned to believe in Jesus. But then once he believed, he remembered all of this rich information that he had about Jesus. And so he had to share it. He had to share it. Okay, I have kept you a minute over, so since I'm preaching today, I'll take that minute off of my lesson. So thank you very much for being here. Next week we will dive into, starting with verse 2, and dive into the text of the letter from James. Thank you very much for being here.